And he made the decision to keep Kurt Warner on the roster in 1998. If they had listened to Jerry Rome, the whole NFL story probably never happens.
Hello, welcome to Beyond the Game. I'm Mike Lacey, and we're here today on a cold winter's day, January 28th, Wednesday. And our guest today is going to be very interesting. Howard Balzer is a nationally renowned broadcaster, journalist. He's an Emmy Award-winning, primarily NFL journalist. He's followed the St. Louis Cardinals, the Arizona Cardinals, and he's actually a voter and on the senior committee for the Hall of Fame in the NFL. He's an expert NFL analyst. He'll be on in a minute with us. He's written a lot of places and reported in a lot of places, but USA Today and Sporting News are some of the places where you've been able to read about and from Howard Balzer. This week, again, on Monday, it was fun yesterday visiting with Xavier Staten and still reminiscing, thinking about that unbelievable game against Arizona in the Marriott Center. Think about it. 5 years ago, we waited every year for that Gonzaga game that would come to Provo. And sometimes St. Mary's, was going to be a big challenge. But you'd wait all season for that game. Now it feels like we're getting that game every single game. The Big 12 is a gauntlet, and it's, you get what you ask for, and here we are in the Big 12, and I guess we couldn't ask for more. I was super impressed with Xavier Staten and his attitude. But on the way to our car in this cold January weather, about 10 o'clock, 9:30 at night after the game, my son Daniel and his wife Brooke were talking about that they attended the game when BYU beat Gonzaga. They said when Gonzaga was rated or ranked number 1 that season. And they came this close to being in another big upset where BYU could have, and maybe even should have, won that game and upset undefeated Arizona. But isn't that the story of life? That's essentially why I like to do this Beyond the Game podcast, because sports mimics, imitates, and even prepares us for life, especially team sports. You see the good and the bad. You experience the difficult and the joyous. Hopefully we get some of that joyous. And that's one of the things that I'll talk about later. We'll talk about with Xavier and the attitude that they have. But you really do, as our mothers told us a long time ago when we lost our first Little League game, you win some and you lose some. It's a long season. Are we going to be the team in a month that we are today? Or are we going to learn from that, from our experiences of this season? And are we as fans going to learn? Our expectations sometimes are so high that we expect the best, and then when we get the best, but it's not quite up to what we expected, then sometimes we get frustrated or even down and depressed. How do we respond to this? It's a long season. We're excited about basketball, and we're excited that soon we're going to be talking with Howard Balzer, who's going to visit with us here on Beyond the Game. Howard, how are you?
I'm good, Mike. How are you doing, man?
Thank you so much for being with us on Beyond the Game.
I'm glad to be with you. Glad to be with you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
We just introduced you a little bit, and I'll do it again because we're live right now. But Howard Balzer, this is going to be your 45th Super Bowl. Is that right?
That is correct. And my streak, if you will, was snapped 5 years ago during the pandemic when I did not go to that Super Bowl, along with many others in the media. But yes, this will be my 45th, which is sometimes hard for me to wrap my arms around.
That's amazing. I mean, here we are, two old dudes. And hopefully we have, I know you do. The whole purpose that I have with Beyond the Game is to really not create, but share the stories beyond and behind the game. And that's what you've been doing your whole career. I mean, there have to be some phenomenal stories. Let me again, just Howard Balzer has written, he's an Emmy Award winning and received, I saw 7 distinguished writing awards. You've written for Sporting News, USA Today. You've been on a lot of different broadcasts, covered the NFL forever. That's what I say about myself. So sorry, I shouldn't say that about you, but 50 years covering the NFL. That's phenomenal. You'd run laps around me if we were talking stats and data. And just to be honest, I did watch you this morning with Pete Souza, and I loved what you guys did. So, Howard, welcome.
Great to be with you. And like I said, it's humbling a lot of times and wrapping my arms around that this has gone on. My wife always asks me, when are you going to retire? And I remember about 10 or 15 years ago saying, well, maybe it's time to slow down a little bit and all that. But hey, I just keep going. I always say, well, as long as I can talk and write and do a lot of editing, I'll just keep doing it for as long as I can, because it's just a blessing to be involved. And who knew 50 years ago that I'd be sitting here talking about this number of Super Bowls and being on the Hall of Fame selection committee. This is my 23rd election that I was involved in. Just so many of that. When I look at the numbers, I say, wow, how did this all happen? But really, how did it go by so quickly? And that's certainly, one of the thoughts. I'll tell you a quick little anecdote. A few years ago, I'm doing a show for Sirius XM NFL Radio in Canton at the Pro Football Hall of Fame enshrinement ceremony. And we tape a lot of interviews during the week that will be aired on Saturday. And we're sitting down talking with Warren Sapp. And before every guy we'd interview, I look at my little book and see when he was enshrined, how long ago it was. I said, boy, Warren, is it hard to believe that it was 7 years ago that you were elected to the Hall of Fame? Time really flies, doesn't it? And he gets this big smile on his face and he says, well, Howard, I always say that days drag, years fly, and decades zoom. And the first reaction was to laugh. And then you start to think about it and you go, boy, is he right. Especially the last part of it. Decades zoom. And, here I am, completing 5 decades, covering the NFL. And once this Super Bowl's over, that completes that 50th season. And so once that starts over, I'll be starting my 6th decade covering the NFL. Like I said, it's humbling, gratifying, and I wouldn't have wanted it any other way.
I had a career-ending injury my senior year, so all my friends who went on to the NFL, I mean, renowned guys like Steve Young and Jim McMahon, Mark Wilson, other guys like Bart Oates, Visek Ahema, Leon White, Glenn Red, Glenn Titensor, Nick Eyre. I mean, so many of these guys went on, and it was fun to watch their careers. But I saw some irony when I read about you on, when I Googled you. And this irony, tell me what you think about this, because because of the injury, I stayed and got a master's degree in accounting. I saw that your parents
Yes.
When you chose to go into journalism, were disappointed because they thought you were going to go into accounting. What's that about?
Well, that was the original plan because, I mean, we're going back almost 60 years. I graduated high school in 1969, and I was obviously into sports. I was, into the numbers. I remember I used to play at that time. There was, I don't know if they still exist. Actually, there was Stratomatic baseball and 8PBA baseball, and they were little card games that you played with dice. And I was an 8PBA guy, and I would play games out with, and I'd actually keep score of the games and all that. So they knew I was into this. So they knew I was into the numbers. And growing up, we'd get the newspapers, and I'd look at the sports sections and talk. There wasn't sports talk radio at the time, but there were talk shows. I grew up in the Philadelphia area, and there were some sports talk shows that I would listen to. It never dawned on me back then that those were jobs, that those were careers. I didn't realize that. So my parents said, well, you know what? You're good with numbers. You go to school in business, and you'll be an accountant. Then you'll be working
Get a real job. Get a real job.
So I thought, well, and they didn't think to say, well, why don't you go into journalism, or why don't you? I don't know that they even knew. And so the crazy part of the story is, it's the summer of 1969, and it's freshman orientation at Hofstra University on Long Island, New York. And it's interesting because I chose to go there instead of Penn State. Didn't apply to a lot of schools. Many of my friends were going to Penn State, the huge school, obviously, with all that tradition. I chose Hofstra. It was a smaller school. I thought that would be better for me. And I had relatives living on Long Island, so that was an attraction. And so we're there at freshman orientation, and they have these tables set up with different clubs and things you can sign up for, right? And so I walked around and I saw Hofstra Chronicle, school newspaper, and I wrote my name down, wrote my name on it, even though, Mike, in high school, I had been turned down to write for the school newspaper there after submitting some kind of audition story. Got turned down. So I signed up. I always say to myself, if I had been at Penn State, I don't know that they would have had tables for people to sign up for, but if they did, I probably wouldn't have had the guts to sign up for a paper at that big a school. And so that's what I did. And lunch, the New York Jets trained at Hofstra University for many, many years. They had training camp there. We had lunch, and there were Jets players sitting all around, and I still have in a box somewhere some autographs that I got. So I wonder, but Joe wasn't in there. I did have Matt Snell and a few other guys, but you always wonder, was that an omen? Was that an omen for the future about that moment? And then, just to complete the story, school starts. I get a call one day from the sports editor of the paper, and with one other guy, and he says, hey, glad you saw. There's only two of us that signed up, right? And he said, if you're interested in working for the paper, great. And I'm thinking to myself, is there going to be an audition story? Well, it wasn't. He just said to me, would you like to cover the soccer team? Obviously, that was my audition, right? But I didn't have to write something just to be asked to do that. The other guy, by the way, was a guy named Pat Calabria, who ended up covering the Islanders in New York and worked for Newsday for many years. And he said to both of us, and if it's one thing you guys want to pursue, one of you could be in my shoes one day as a sports editor. And Pat ended up being the sports editor at some point. So that started my journey in journalism with the school paper, got involved with the sports information office. And it was at that point that I said, this is what I want to do. The heck with this accounting stuff. And so that's the background.
I was the same way, but a little bit later. I wasn't as quick as you with my passion for going into, but as I got the master's degree in accounting, I realized, hey, I had been on the football team. I had this career-ending knee injury. I was recovering from that. And I realized, no, I don't want to sit on the sidelines and take notes or take pictures or, be the guy reporting on the action. I wanted to be in the action. So I figured I'm going to go into the stock market. And I've been in that game all my life and still love that, regardless of the ups and downs. But isn't it ironic that both you and I now are essentially on the sidelines, but covering the stories.
Yeah, no doubt. And I know we want to talk about a lot of other things, but the last note is when I got out of school, what I really wanted to do was get into that sports information team PR aspect of it. I wasn't looking to write for a paper or do anything. That's because I really did a lot with that during my years there in college with the sports information office. And I applied for jobs here and there, and I didn't get one. I didn't get this. And then my first job ended up being after a couple of PR jobs. Then I ended up with a weekly football newspaper in Long Island. And that really started the football journey of this all, which has brought me to where I am today.
It's interesting that you started with baseball, which is a stat intensive game, right? I grew up in Northern California. My father had been a professional baseball player, and he took us to the Candlestick Park to watch the San Francisco Giants, who within that decade had come from New York. But baseball was always one of my first loves. I have a lot of family and friends who don't like the fact that I'm a Giants fan because they're Dodgers fans. But you're probably a Philly fan, or what kind of fandom in baseball are you with, Howard?
Well, that's what I grew up with. I grew up as a Phillies fan, as an Eagles fan, 76ers, the Flyers. When I was a teenager, became an expansion team in the NHL. So all the Philly fans is what I was, passionate about, where I did most of my growing up from third grade on through high school. And so, I mean, heck, I can remember crying when the Philadelphia Warriors, prior to the 76ers, moved to San Francisco during, I think it was the early 60s. And they had Wilt Chamberlain. And I mean, oh my goodness. I mean, how could they do this to people and move and relocate? And then they ended up, the 76ers had been in Syracuse as the Syracuse Nationals. And they ended up moving to Philly a few years later to fill that NBA hole. But I was always passionate, Philly fan. And that was, like I said, a big part of my growing up years. And what a city to be in terms of all that. The one negative, I guess, is you could say is here I lived through that location as a young boy, and then as an adult living in St. Louis, and then living in St. Louis, I saw two teams relocate in the NFL when the Cardinals moved to here in Arizona, where I am now, in 1988, and then St. Louis got the Rams. And then the Rams moved back to LA, of course. Hard to believe that's been 10 years ago. Talk about a decade zooming. It's been, 10 years since the Rams left. So, yeah, that like I said, those were the teams that, I grew up. I'm not as much of a quote of those, certainly I'm always a little partial to them, but didn't maintain a lot of that crazy fanhood when you get into journalism and you live in some other places. But what I've always found is where you live, you'd like to see those local teams do well, because it's a lot more fun when that happens than if they're not very good.
It is so much fun. And the NFL, I mean, when you consider that in the 1970s, probably baseball was America's pastime, baseball and apple pie. Obviously now the NFL, and I don't know, I know we need to get into our stories because you have some phenomenal stories, but there's a guy in Ted Lasso, and that's the other football, right?
Yes.
But in Ted Lasso, the quote from Danny Rojas is, "Football is life." And I know there are the serious among us are going to say, "Well, that's not true." But in so many ways, especially team sports, but particularly football, mimics life, prepares us for life, as players especially, but also as fans. So I wanted to hear, first of all, a sidelight. As you were talking, I thought the news of the last couple of days, and you're on the voting for the Hall of Fame, so maybe you don't want to talk about this, but the big thing was Bill Belichick didn't make the Hall of Fame. Any comments?
Well, it's not a question of not wanting to talk, but we as selectors, we voted a couple of weeks ago, and we are sworn to secrecy, and we don't even know who was elected. And so it's kind of troubling sometimes when something like this gets out early and someone who's not supposed to talk does.
Did. Okay.
And then all of a sudden the story blows up and it's crazy. I'm getting calls from TMZ and different and all this stuff to comment on it. And
Right.
what I do basically is I'll reserve comment. And everyone wants to know how I voted. And I say I'll reserve comment until after it becomes official. And I don't know for a fact that Bill Belichick is not in. But one of the key points, Mike, is this. And this is lost in a lot of this debate now, that it certainly gets a certain level of ugliness and nastiness on social media. But most of those people don't know the process and don't know how it works and don't know that it was changed for the 2025 class that has led to some of the result like last year, where there was only 3 modern day guys from the Final 5 and only one of the 5 candidates for coach, one contributor, and 3 seniors players. And only one of those 5 got in because of the way we vote near the end, which changed from the way it was. And so for people who don't know quickly, in the past, we would vote once modern day guys got to the Final 5. And from that final group of contributor, coach, and seniors players, we would vote on each one individually, yes or no. And if they got 80%, they were elected. Well, they changed it to now, quote, not making it as automatic. We voted to 7 from the 15. And then each of us voted for 5 guys. And then they'll take a minimum of 3, but up to 5, who get 80%. From the other group, there's only a minimum of 1, and also it could be a minimum of 3 up to 5. For the other one, it's a minimum of 1 up to 3. Well, if you do the math of it, and I'll talk about the group of 5 because we're talking about the Belichick deal.
Sure.
150 votes. If you just do the easy math, 50 selectors, 3 votes each. So there's 150 votes. So last year there was one, Sterling Sharp. So let's just say he got 40 votes. He might have got 42. Who knows? He might not have got 40. But the minimum requires someone to be elected. So if someone has less than 40 to reach that one or reach the other 3, they're going to get in even with less than 80%. Well, let's, for argument's sake, say Sterling Sharp got 40. Well, that only leaves 110 votes for the other 4 guys. So it becomes really, really difficult for anyone else to also get 40 votes. And in this situation, so I think it's very difficult in this debate not to have the full context of who else got in. If anyone else, we don't even know who did. Was it 1? Was it 2? Was it 3? Did Patriots owner Robert Kraft, who was a finalist, did he get in or did he not? We don't know. But the voting, when you pick the 3, all of that goes into the thinking when you're deciding which 3 guys to vote for. Seniors players who have been eligible for a long, long time are in the process. And if one of them doesn't get in, who knows? They might never get into that finalist group again. I mean, if Bill Belichick didn't get elected, he'll be a finalist again. I think that's pretty clear. Sure. Of course, by not being elected, it keeps another coach from being a finalist. But Robert Kraft, some of the same arguments that people are making for Bill Belichick, you can make for Robert Kraft. I mean, what's the one thing everyone always says about sports and all business, Mike? Success starts at the top, right? Robert Kraft was the owner who was kind of laughed at when he hired Bill Belichick, and not only as head coach, but put him in control of the football organization. People said, "What are you doing? You're crazy." Well, then we saw the success that they had. He's also done other things for the league and all that. So you can make a strong case for Robert Kraft at the age of, I think he's 85 or 86, that it's time for him to go in. But no one's talking about him. They're only talking about Bill Belichick. And so I think knowing what happened is important to get the full context of what this vote was and what it will end up learning, a week from Thursday at NFL Honors, and then really being able to get a better grasp on how this occurred and what happens realistically in the voting process that we're now asked to do.
Thank you, man. That's a complicated process for you, and you're on that senior committee of the Hall of Fame selection process. You told me that you knew of Blair Buswell.
Yes.
Blair was a teammate of mine at BYU. He was a running back, and he and I both, we played special teams. We didn't get into the notoriety as much. We weren't notorious. We weren't famous like Steve Young or Jim McMahon, but it was sure fun to be part of those teams and be part of those stories. Do you have any Blair? Because a lot of our people may not be aware that Blair Buswell does the busts. He's a famous sculptor, does the busts for the NFL Hall of Fame and also Baseball Hall of Fame and other things like that. How do you know Blair Buswell, and what's your experience with our friend?
Well, I usually write a story each year for the Hall of Fame yearbook that gets published around the enshrinement ceremony. And sometimes I've written about a guy from the Rams that I was close to when they got elected, like Kurt Warner, Aeneas Williams, Orlando Pace, Isaac Bruce. When there's not a Rams guy in there, then we come up with some other angle. And so one year, I believe it was about 7 or 8 years ago, I said, I think it would be cool to do a story on Blair, the guy who does the bus, and just have him you talk about telling stories. And so I had a long conversation with him that was just phenomenal. And the hardest thing was deciding what to use and what I couldn't use because I didn't have enough words that I was able to write. And he told tremendous stories about first how he got into all this. It was doing a special bust that Ed DeBartolo, he'd heard that he was doing some things with sculpting, and he asked him to do a bust for Bill Walsh for a special presentation that the 49ers were doing. And then after that, DeBartolo apparently told the Hall of Fame, hey, I don't know who's you're doing your bust, but you got to talk to this guy. He ended up, doing it. And so the stories he told about, because what they do is, in the past, before he did it, the guys doing the bust would basically do it off a picture, or pictures. Blair would use those, but he wanted to meet the guy in person, get an essence of him, look at him and all that. Then he'd ask the guy, at what stage of your career do you want this, to represent? It's why, Deion Sanders has the do-rag, right? And Drew Pearson has the afro and things like that on the bust. But he would tell amazing story. He told me amazing stories about just those meetings with these guys. One that I remember, he talked about he was doing Terry Bradshaw, and he was getting a little antsy, a little fidgety. He'd been sitting around a long time, and Blair could sense that all this. He says, "Hey, let's just go outside and talk and just relax for a bit." And they got out of football, and Terry started throwing footballs to him, right? And so he had great stories. Great insight. He doesn't do all the busts. Maybe last year he did because there were only 4 of them. But when there was, times when there were 7, 8, 9 guys getting in, he had some others that are working with him. I know he's been doing it for a long time, so it might not be a lot of years where he keeps doing it. But he was fascinating to talk to, and I loved writing that story. And it was really one of the most fun stories that I can recall writing.
Blair has a wonderful studio here in just within 5 miles of where I'm sitting right now. He's in Pleasant Grove, Utah. He gave us my wife and I, a personal tour, and that guy has done some phenomenal work. And yes, his stories, especially when he sits down with a particular athlete and gets to know them, not just physically looking at them, but hearing them tell their stories. If he goes out with Terry Bradshaw and catches balls, what an interesting career that young man has. A lot of people that might listen to our podcast or see it may not be aware of someone that you and I are both well aware of, you even more than I, but the story of Kurt Warner. First of all, Kurt, what I'm most aware of, and what a lot of people will be aware of, is at one point he went from Northern Iowa. He got cut from the Packers, and he was working in a grocery store. And then you covered the St. Louis Cardinals. Was it the Rams or the Cardinals?
That was the Rams.
That was the Rams.
The Cardinals were gone by then.
So one of my friends, Keith Heidemann from St. Louis, I don't think he'll ever forgive the Rams for leaving St. Louis, but that's another story altogether. Tell us what you're familiar with Kurt Warner, because his story is one of the bust to boom stories of all time.
In any sport.
In any sport, you're right.
In any sport. And just to fill in some of that, the whole, working in the grocery store came at a similar time that he was also playing arena football, indoor football with the Iowa Barnstormers. And he never got an NFL look. There was one year that the Bears gave him a tryout, and weird thing happened. He got bit. I forget what it was. He got bit by a scorpion. He got bit by something, and his hand swelled up, and he had to cancel the tryout, and it never happened again. But the real behind-the-scenes story, Mike, is that after playing all these years in arena football, there was a guy by the name of Al Lukenbill, and he was the head coach of the Amsterdam team, the Amsterdam Admirals in NFL Europe. And he wanted to get a quarterback. And at the time, the NFL allocated players on their roster to NFL Europe, also called the World League. And you could allocate up to 10 guys. And a lot of teams would send offensive linemen to give them game,
experience
and all that. So anyway, he wanted a quarterback that he could tell the fans was on an NFL roster. So he calls Charlie Army, who's in charge of personnel for the Rams, tells him what's going on. He says, I'd like you to give this Kurt Warner a tryout. If you like anything of what he sees, at least just sign him to a contract and you can allocate him to us. So Charlie agrees. Kurt comes in for a tryout. He tells the story of how he called his wife Brenda afterward and said, I don't think they're signing me. I just didn't throw the ball well. But Charlie was doing a favor for his buddy, so they signed him.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
And that was for the 1998 season. Well, I go to the Senior Bowl that year, and here's a little behind-the-scenes story. I go to the Senior Bowl in 98. I was doing a radio broadcast for a national network, and I run into Dick Vermeil during the day, and he says, hey, Howard, how you doing? And this is one of the greatest people I've ever met. And I still have a good relationship with him. And he said, hey, we're all going to dinner at, I forget the name of the place, across the bay in Mobile. We're going to dinner tonight. Why don't you come over and join us? I said, oh, that's nice. That's cool. No other media there. And all it is Rams coaches and personnel people. And here I am, a fish out of water a little bit. I walk into this place with kind of picnic tables with the red and white linoleum tablecloth. I think it was a barbecue place or maybe a seafood place. And I was thinking, where am I going to sit? So I see an empty spot next to Jerry Rome, who is the Rams offensive coordinator. And I knew, and I had followed the Arena League. In fact, I wrote, when I was at the Sporting News back in '87, I wrote the first public story about the plans for arena football and a demonstration game they had in Rockford, Illinois. So I had followed them. And in fact, in St. Louis, I had done a playoff game for a local radio station in St. Louis when the St. Louis Stallions, I think was their name, they played the Barnstormers in Iowa in a playoff game. So anyway, I knew of the league and I followed it. I knew the owner and the commissioner and all that stuff. So anyway, I'm trying to get my train of thought here. So I knew Kurt Warner. So I said to Jerry Rome, hey, I see you sign that guy from the Arena League. And he looks at me with this like quizzical look, like he doesn't know what I'm talking about. Right. And I said, yeah, Kurt Warner. And he does a little harumph and doesn't say anything more. I come to find out later, he wasn't even this is the offensive coordinator of the team. He wasn't even at the tryout when Kurt came in for that tryout. And the other part of the story, which is really crucial, Mike, is that Jerry Rome had one of his little, favorite pet quarterbacks, a guy by the name of Will Fuhrer, who was a left-handed quarterback. And he had been with the guy. He brought him to St. Louis in '97 to be the number 3 quarterback. He wasn't a starter, but just give him a job as a backup, right? Well, the Rams cut a guy named Jamie Martin to keep Will Fuhrer on the roster. Now, Jamie Martin was a journeyman, but he was in the NFL for 10 to 13 years, played some. He was much better than Will Fuhrer, but they kept Will Fuhrer because that's who Jerry Rome wanted. Well, now we fast forward to 1998 training camp. Kurt has played in the World League, right? He does well there, misses all the offseason program, comes to the Rams in like mid-June and to get ready for training camp in July, right? And didn't do much in preseason. He told me at times he would call his wife. He says, boy, this isn't going well. And Charlie Army, hey, just keep at it. Keep doing what you're doing. Comes time for cut, and guess what? Jerry Rome wants to keep Will Fuhrer as the number 3. Dick Vermeil, and he says it to this day, he saw something in Kurt Warner that intrigued him. And a couple other coaches agreed with him, and he made the decision to keep Kurt Warner on the roster in 1998. If they had listened to Jerry Rome, the whole NFL story probably never happens. Probably never happens. 98, he had 11 pass attempts in the final game of the regular season because of injuries. And then, of course, we know what happened in 1999. So it's a phenomenal story, but it's those little things sometimes that happen that pave the way for good things. And you just never know when those things are going to happen. But, Dick Vermeil overruled Jerry Rome and the rest.
And, that's very, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just saying the rest, as they say, is history.
Well, the rest is history. And I want you to, Kurt Warner won some Super Bowls and went on and had a storied career in the NFL. So here he was, not recognized by anybody, relegated by his offensive coordinator, who wasn't even interested in the tryout that Kurt Warner held. The offensive coordinator had his pet player wanted, and yet Dick Vermeil, this is so infrequent that a head coach will not bypass, but supersede what the offensive coordinator wants. I wonder, did you hear of any tension that caused, or did Jerry Rome recognize, oh yeah, you were right, this is great?
No, I don't think Jerry Rome ever thought that. And Kurt didn't, play that much that year. Well, obviously only until the last game of the season. But he was scout team and doing all those things. Well, then after that season, Dick Vermeil came in. That was Dick. 97 was his first year, and the Rams had moved to St. Louis in 95. They won 7 games the first year, 6 games the second year. Vermeil comes in, they win 5, and then the following year in 98 they win only 4. And there was talk that Dick Vermeil might be gone. That he heard all the game has passed him by stuff and all those things. And the team wasn't good the year before. Tony Banks was the quarterback. They lost their starting running back, I think, in the second week of the season, a guy by the name of Greg Bell. And so it was clear that Vermeil was going to have to make some changes. And that's when he brought in Mike Martz as the offensive coordinator. And Jerry Rome, they moved on from him. And Martz didn't know who Kurt Warner was. In fact, Kurt went up to see him one day after Martz got hired. And Kurt's kind of a little, big guy, not huge, but a big guy. Mike Martz thought he was a tight end. And Mike Martz is hard on young quarterbacks. He is very hard on them. And so, but, he was working with them starting in 99. And then, but of course, they had brought in also Trent Green as a free agent from Washington. Martz had been with Washington prior, and they signed Green as an unrestricted free agent who grew up in St. Louis. And that was the big homecoming. And preseason, the team was playing great. There was all these high hopes. They had traded for Marshall Faulk. They had drafted Torrey Holt. They'd made some other moves to help the talent. And then, of course, the famous preseason game against the then San Diego Chargers, when Trent Green went down with a torn ACL, and the classic film of Isaac Bruce knowing what happened and seeing Trent on the turf, pounding the turf in disgust because he knew what he felt they were going to be with Trent Green. And then a couple days later, Dick Vermeil sits in front of the media and says, with tears running down his face, which we know often happens with Dick Vermeil, he said, "We will rally around Kurt Warner and play good football." Well, even he admits to this day, he never had any inkling that it would develop into what it did in that 99 season. But they were injury-free. Torrey Holt, Isaac Bruce combined for great things. The offensive line stayed healthy. The defense played well. And here all of a sudden, they're in the Super Bowl. It was just an unbelievable story. And Kurt Warner ends up being not only the MVP of the season in the NFL, but he ends up being Super Bowl MVP. Just totally amazing story.
And I'm forgetting the quote. I mean, the greatest game on turf, what was it called?
The greatest show on turf.
The greatest show on turf. Their offense became the greatest show on turf. And Kurt Warner was in the middle of it. And imagine that only years ago, he was stocking shelves in a grocery store.
Playing arena football.
And playing arena football. It's amazing to me. It's very similar, it's parallel to what a story Steve Young tells. And I was there when we had a certain offensive coordinator who didn't like lefties, didn't like people who broke out of the pocket, wanted a pocket passer. And Steve Young even tells, I was 8th string quarterback at the time. They were considering moving him to safety or cornerback. He was so fast. But the rest is history. And Lavelle Edwards and another offensive coordinator saw something in Steve Young, and then the rest is history with him too. He even had a long tenure, making his way to the 49ers and then being second string to Joe Montana. How long can you do that?
And who knows what would have happened if, he was with the Buccaneers, not a very good franchise at the time, and they traded him. I'm pretty sure it was a trade to the 49ers, and Bill Walsh, saw something. But the other part you just talked about, Young, who was a big time runner and, used his athletic ability a lot. And that was one thing when he became the quarterback for the 49ers after Montana moved on, is the one thing that Bill Walsh did say, hey, I'm not telling you don't run at all, but that can't be your first inclination. You still got to go through the progressions, and we will coach you to do that with the talent that they have. And then if there's nothing there, yeah, you can run, but you can't run too soon. And he, helped develop that in him, where, the pocket passing and all that is still very important. Even these quarterbacks these days that run, obviously there's the possibility of injury when these running quarterbacks run, but they still have to be able to operate in the pocket, throwing the football if their teams are going to be successful. And that's what Steve Young became under Bill Walsh, and of course became a Pro Football Hall of Famer.
And if you and I take our accounting capacities, our expert accounting analysis, you'd say if you capitalize the value of that quarterback, the money that you're paying them, the capacity they have to enable your team to get to a Super Bowl, you don't want your quarterback running every play. In fact, you want him running less, right?
No question about it. Now, I don't know, this is probably not going to be that big a story, but there's some little rumblings of it that Drake May of the Patriots got his shoulder banged up on a run in the game last week against the Broncos. And quite frankly, that was a big reason the Patriots won that game. It wasn't because of Drake May, but because of the plays he made running in that game in some big situations. And so here he is with, it's not believed to be serious, and the Patriots are trying to downplay it, and they don't have to have an injury report until next week. So we'll see what happens there. But yeah, in that respect, we've seen it with Baltimore. Look at the years, look at how good Lamar Jackson is, and yet look at the times that he hasn't been available because of injuries to them. Josh Allen has been kind of a unicorn because he runs a good deal, but he's big and all that, and he's strong, but you still can get injured, obviously. And he's been able to avoid those injuries and obviously do all the things he's capable of doing. But that is a fear. That all these, it's kind of like when the basketball player takes that crazy shot and the coach is going, no, and then it goes in and he goes, yeah. Well, that's what happens when the quarterback runs. They're going, oh no. And then they're just happy. Not that the run was only successful, but that he got up and is healthy afterwards, because they all live in fear of that injury to their quarterback. And it definitely affects. It's affected Daniel Jones. A lot of injuries in his career. It happened this year in Indianapolis, and it sent their season down the tubes. It's happened to Kyler Murray. He's only been available for about 72% of the Cardinals games since he's been drafted because of injuries. And that's always the fear and always the worry when you have that style of quarterback.
It's fascinating. I don't know if you paid attention or pay attention much to the NCAA, but Fernando Mendoza, is known for being a great passer, but when it really got down to it on fourth down, even he broke out of the pocket. And essentially, that was the game-winning play, that put them ahead enough that Miami couldn't come back.
No, that was definitely it. And what he'll be in the NFL, we'll see. Certainly there's always hype around him when they come to the NFL. Certainly there's always – I never like to call them really mistakes because, hey, you draft who the guys are available that year. But there's no question that some quarterbacks get pushed up in the process because teams are so desperate to get that guy when they don't have one. But they have to be sure to have the team around that quarterback if you're going to be successful. And that's one thing about football, Mike, and you talked about, beyond the game and all those things. But it always gets me when I hear someone talk about a quarterback and say he won, right? Or he lost, as if he's the only one out there, like in golf or or something like that. Obviously, you have to have those players around you, and especially the offensive line. Hey, perfect example is 2 Super Bowls in the last the 2020 season and the 2025 last season. Patrick Mahomes was made to look mortal because his line couldn't protect him in the 2020 season game against the Tampa Bay, and then last season against the Eagles. Their pass rush and their defensive line just dominated the Chiefs' offensive line, and like I said, Mahomes was made to look like just a guy because of that, and that just shows how important you have to have the team around the quarterback with a running game most of the time if you're going to have that consistent success and have a chance to win a championship.
We're kind of a BYU-centric group here, I having played there, and a lot of our fans are BYU-oriented. And fortunately, a lot of our teammates and people have gone on. Kyle Van Noy and Fred Warner are 2 very notorious guys doing really well in the NFL. It's interesting. Why am I forgetting? Is it Sam Darnold, the quarterback
of Seattle?
Yeah.
Sam Darnold.
Darnold, yes.
Believe it or not, the first USC quarterback to ever start in a Super Bowl.
Now, that's surprising. Think about it.
Yeah, I was a little surprised. Of course, they had that great run of running backs that were great in the NFL. But, Matt Leinart was a first-round pick. Didn't work out for him. That was another one of those guys that came into the NFL and combination of factors, and it just never worked out for him. And it looked like that was going to be the case for Sam Darnold, who went with a bad franchise, a bad team, and got some injuries that kept him off the field. Hurt continuity. They changed coaches, which means you change the offensive coordinator, now a new system to learn. And all of a sudden he lands in Minnesota last season, and he's playing like people would have thought he would have played from day one, which sometimes doesn't happen. And now here he is, playing excellent football for the Seahawks on a team, by the way, Mike, that I think it's forgotten sometimes how important complementary football is, because we tend to segment football in our analysis, offense in one box, defense in another box, special teams in another one, because they are obviously special units with different players. But you have to have, most of the time you have to be complementary. Offense keeps the ball, has drives, keeps the defense off the field. Defense gets takeaways, stops team. Once in a while you get a Baltimore Ravens that has just such a dominating defense. They can win without great offense, but they also won the Super Bowl with an extraordinary running back in Jamal Lewis. So you still have to have some semblance of an offense, and it has to be complementary. And with Darnold now with Seattle, with that defense they have, he can be coached. And hey, if it's 3rd and 9, 3rd and 11, there's no crime in punting, right? There's no crime in punting. We'll get the ball back. Our defense will get you the ball back, and we'll live to see another series. Don't force it. Don't throw the ball where you shouldn't. Don't make a bad decision. That's one of the most important things that quarterbacks have to learn. And he's done that for the most part with the Seahawks, and here they are in the Super Bowl.
It's an interesting, again, it applies a little bit to our BYU fan base because the Jets were kind of the graveyard of quarterbacks, and they got rid of Sam Darnold to take our Zach Wilson from BYU. And Zach obviously is kind of in that graveyard still. I shouldn't say that, but not far from being where Kurt Warner was, and Sam Darnold was there, but he made it back. It's exciting to see that people don't quit. They keep getting up. Football is a game of downs and first downs and games during the season and then a different season. It's fun to see Sam Darnold successful.
No doubt about it. And you love to see, those stories. You love to see the guy who was the undrafted free agent and makes a roster and then ends up being a big contributor. It shows to a degree what a crapshoot the NFL draft is. Although even even having said that, I think of the 12 teams that played in the first week of the playoffs, with Seattle and Denver being off, and they had first round quarterbacks. So if you look at the 14 teams in the playoffs, 12 had quarterbacks selected in the first round. So even though it can be dangerous to do that, it's usually the best path to get that guy. But like I said, you have to make sure to put the team around him. And now you've got 2 first-round quarterbacks in the Super Bowl, and the teams they beat. Denver had a first-round quarterback, and let me see. Well, I'm trying to remember who's Seattle. What short-term memory here? Seattle beat the Rams with a first-round quarterback in Matthew Stafford, even though a couple of them are on teams that didn't draft them, but they were still picked in the first round. So that usually is the best path to getting the guy that can play for you for a long time. But again, you better build that team around them.
I love how you bring up complementary football to kind of finish off, because special teams, defense, offense, it's all critical together. I hear football players now, not just on our teams, but on other teams, talking about do your job.
Right.
And if it's in football, it's 1/11th. If it's in basketball, you're doing your 1/5. You talked about Dick Vermeil. I was blessed to have Dick Vermeil come to my home, recruiting me to UCLA from Rancho Cordova, California. Back in 1974, he came to our house. I graduated in 75. But you have some wonderful stories. I didn't know Dick Vermeil that well, except that he offered me, but I didn't take it. Tell us, because it's obvious that he has a tender heart. We're coming down to the end here. Tell us what your feelings are about people like Dick Vermeil, who create this culture, this winning culture that's still good and human.
I think it's very important. I remember when he wasn't successful for those 2 years in St. Louis, and they said, well, his way doesn't work anymore, right? He gets too close to the players, gets too emotional, all those things. Then when they won, everyone said, well, that's because he got close to the players, right? And he built that culture. So everyone looks for the reason why a team won or lost, but that's just the way he is. I mean, that's the type of guy he is. I mean, I could tell you stories for another whole hour on things, just personal things that happened with me that just showed his humanity and what he did. But he was a tough coach. There was almost a mutiny. He was having 3-a-days in training camp and he always says, well, it wasn't to really be hard on the guys. It was just to find out the guys that really wanted to commit themselves. But there was a mutiny where guys, hey, this is getting to be too much. And he did adjust. He did adjust afterwards, but he adjusted with the players that he knew would go that extra mile to be winners and to be team first guys. But he's the type of guy, whenever I talk to him, and it's not a lot, but it's relatively, frequently, every time, I mean, he'll say to me at the end of the conversation, say hello to Bernie for me. Hope she's doing good. That's my wife's nickname. And so, we've had dinner together, and he always asks that. He never misses, saying that. That's just the type of guy he is. And I'll try to tell this one quick. Super Bowl in Atlanta, 1999 season. I'm a pool reporter for the Rams. I go out to practice. There's only one reporter there. It's brutally cold, and I'm not dressed for the part, right? I didn't realize how cold it was going to be in Atlanta. No gloves, no hat, not much of a jacket. He comes out in a Rams parka, wool cap, gloves, and the whole bit. He comes walking towards me. I said, hey, coach. And he says, Howard, get your butt, and he didn't say butt. He says, get your butt inside and ask Todd to give you whatever you need to stay warm. And Todd was their equipment manager. And he had commandeered a room in this building. It was the Falcons facility. He had commandeered a room with as much cold weather gear as to outfit an army in Siberia. And he'd also ordered space heaters to line the sidelines so that when players weren't involved on the field in a segment, they were just standing around, they would at least not be totally cold, because it was windy and cold. It was an open field where the wind just whipped across. And I asked Todd, how'd you know about this? He said, well, I looked at the weather report before the game last week just to see what it was going to be. Saw it was going to be this way, and I loaded up everything I could. And so I got gloves, which are still up here on the shelf. I got a hat. I got thermal underwear. Didn't have the guts to ask for a parka. that would have been really nice. And the great cool thing about it is I had a great pool report, because that was a big part of my pool report of what the equipment manager had done to keep the team, relatively comfortable during the practice week with as cold as it was in Atlanta. But that was the essence of Dick Vermeil. First thing he says to me, go in there and get something to keep yourself warm. That's classic Coach Vermeil.
Who knew that a journalist would end up with a bunch of swag?
Yeah, who knew? Who knew on that?
I love that, Howard. Thank you for being with us today. I know we could talk for hours.
Oh,
you've got stories. You've forgotten more stories than I can remember. But thank you for sharing these stories. Do you have any final thoughts for our audience at Beyond the Game?
Just hope it's a good Super Bowl. It'll be my 45th. Like I said, looking forward, to that. And then the final thought is we didn't even get a chance to talk about the NFL draft and me being on the first broadcast back in 1980. Maybe we get closer to the draft, we can do this again, and we can talk about the evolution of that and some of the stories I have, associated with the NFL draft going back all those years to the first one in 1980.
Oh, I mean, seriously, the
first one, televised.
Let's do that. I want to do that because it'll be so fun to even talk about. I remember when Steve Young was initially drafted into the USFL.
Right.
And so, and he signed an unbelievable contract with them. You'll have magnitudes more stories about that draft. Thank you, Howard.
My pleasure, man. Enjoy talking to you.
Well, that was interesting. Very interesting visiting with Howard Balzer, a journalist and a guy who's followed the NFL for longer than some of us have been alive. Not me, but some of you. It's fun to hear from him some of these stories that help us become better people, help us overcome the trials and frustrations of life. I remember when I was choosing my career, whether to go to New York City or to San Francisco and be with the big financial Goldman Sachs's or Salomon Brothers. And when I chose to be in a little bit smaller game with Dean Witter in Sacramento, it was a life choice. But I saw a lot of my friends went on to bigger and opportunities that were even bigger than what I had, even though I'm very grateful for what I had. So life, the games that we enter, the challenges that come before us, we all believe, and I believe that we're prepared for those. And I see this basketball team. What will the finishing touches be on our BYU basketball team? Now that we've had a couple pieces of adversity where we were close enough to win against the top-rated undefeated team in the country, what will our finishing touches be that make us just a little bit better, that make these individuals even just a little bit better? Because they are phenomenally good, phenomenally great in the individual basketball. And then as a team, they're playing better and better, learning wonderful things. The do your job part, we hear frequently from our football team, I'm going to do my 1/11th. Now with the basketball team, I'm going to do my 1/5, or I'm going to do my job. I loved how Xavier Staten, when I was so essentially down that we didn't win the game, and he saw humbly a great play by an associate of his, Braden Burries, a wonderful freshman, a great basketball player who came from nowhere to block a shot that would have won the game for BYU. It's interesting from the perspective of players how, hey, that's not the end of the world. We saw a great game and we saw two great teams, and the opportunities for both teams, but particularly our BYU team coming back from such a deep hole says that there's great opportunity for this team to be phenomenal. Our first test after this is going to be Kansas. We're taping this on Wednesday. Hopefully it'll be out on Friday. And our game against Kansas in Manhattan, Kansas isn't going to be easy. It's number 13 BYU against number 14 Kansas. Howard brought up in the Super Bowl how you get these two teams, 48 players on each team. And they're, as I remember someone speaking to me, they're la creme de la creme, the cream of the crop. They're the cream of the cream. And these guys are people who have made it through many different siftings. And yet, how does that apply to our life? When you think about Steve Young almost becoming a defensive back, when you think about Kurt Warner, but for an offensive coordinator who was overridden by his head coach, would never have played probably in the NFL. Some of us get our opportunities late or come from out of nowhere and have these opportunities to make a dent in the world and make an impact on life. That's why one of the reasons why I like sports as metaphors for life. There will always be a loser in the Super Bowl, despite the fact that these two teams come together as the best of each of their conferences. There will be a loser. I love the fact that from Brent Johnson's episode more than a year ago, when he shared his deep thoughts and sentiments on missing a field goal in a critical game against that same Indiana school that just won the national championship, how Brent Johnson learned from an event that at the time was devastating. Now, I don't know that we think of that as such a terrible thing, but a learning experience for each of us and an uplifting story that Brent will be able to share and has shared all his life, and that we can continue and then apply it to our lives. Sometimes we get knocked down, but then we get up again, as that song says. I love that each of us has a story. Every single human being has a good story. We can learn from them. Here we are at Beyond the Game. Thank you for being with us. This is signing out from Beyond the Game. Go Cougs against Kansas, and let's enjoy the journey even when we have some losses. I expect that we're going to win the next national championship. Thank you.
We are Rogue Media Sports.